The SS Richard Montgomery ran aground and sank just off Sheerness back in 1944.
On August 20th, 1944, the fate of one of the world's largest cities was sealed not by a battle, but by a storm. The American Liberty ship, the SS Richard Montgomery, ran aground carrying thousands of tons of bombs.
The SS Richard Montgomery went down in 1944 carrying 1,400 tons of explosives.
Today it sits in two pieces just 50 feet below the surface. We're going to explore why deep-sea divers refuse to enter the SS Richard Montgomery and reveal what's inside that truly terrifies them. The answer involves unstable, sweating explosives, a potential 16-foot tsunami, and a government that has been holding its breath for nearly a century. Why no one will touch this ship? To put it mildly, the destructive potential here is staggering. Experts at the Royal Military College of Science calculated that if the cargo were to detonate, it would trigger one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. The blast would be so powerful it would register on seismographs across Europe. It would create a crater 100 feet deep on the seabed and send a column of water, mud, and twisted metal nearly 2 miles into the atmosphere. What many people overlook is the immediate aftermath, a 16-foot-high tsunami. This wave would completely overwhelm the nearby town of Sheerness, which has a population of over 20,000, before surging up the Thames, potentially flooding parts of East London. But here's the kicker. The direct blast and the wave might not even be the worst part. The wreck is located less than a few miles from the Isle of Grain, home to a massive liquefied natural gas LNG import terminal. This facility holds enormous containers of highly flammable gas, each one the size of a sports stadium. If the shockwave from the Montgomery's explosion were to rupture these tanks, it would trigger a secondary chain reaction of fireballs and blasts that would make the initial event look like a firecracker. The consequences would be, without exaggeration, apocalyptic. This is why many are crazy about getting the situation resolved. So, what exactly is inside that terrifies experts? The cargo holds contain thousands of munitions, including hundreds of 250-pound and 500-pound bombs. The primary explosive is TNT. Over 8 decades, salt water has seeped into the holds, corroding the bomb casings. The thing nobody tells you is what happens to old TNT when it gets wet and breaks down. It can form highly sensitive picric acid crystals. These crystals are so volatile that the slightest friction, a sudden jolt, or even a change in temperature could be enough to set them off. If one bomb goes, the immense pressure would instantly trigger a sympathetic detonation of the entire payload. It's a chain reaction that could happen in less than a second. For a diver, swimming through those dark, decaying holds would be like navigating a minefield where the mines are sweating nitroglycerin. The slightest bump from a scuba tank or a drop tool could be the last mistake they ever make. The government has designated a strict exclusion zone around the wreck, but believe it or not, that hasn't stopped thrill seekers. In recent years, paddleboarders have been photographed touching the masts, completely unaware that they are poking a sleeping dragon. The ship itself is groaning under the strain. It broke its back on the sandbank 80 years ago and now exists as 2 separate pieces, held together only by the seabed. Sonar scans showed the steel hull is corroding and weakening with every passing tide. The clock is ticking, but the solution remains a horrifying puzzle. What nobody can agree on is how this happened, an ocean lifeline with a fatal flaw. To understand how a ship full of bombs ended up as a ticking time bomb at London's doorstep, you have to go back to the darkest days of World War II. In the early 1940s, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard. German U-boats were hunting in wolf packs, sinking hundreds of Allied supply ships and threatening to starve Great Britain into submission. The United States, realizing the urgent need for a massive supply chain, launched one of the most ambitious shipbuilding programs in history, the Liberty ships. The SS Richard Montgomery was one of these vessels. The thing is, Liberty ships were never designed for longevity. They were the definition of quantity over quality. The goal was to build them faster than the enemy could sink them. And the speed was breathtaking. On average, a Liberty ship could be constructed in just over 40 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously built in an astonishing 4 days and 15.5 hours as a publicity stunt. They were made from prefabricated sections, welded together like a giant puzzle. This welding, however, was a critical and ultimately fatal shortcut. Traditionally, ships were built with overlapping steel plates riveted together. Riveting allowed the hull to flex and absorb stress. More importantly, if a crack formed in one plate, the rivets would stop it from spreading. But welding was faster and cheaper. What many overlooked at the time was that the steel being used was of poor quality due to wartime shortages. In the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, this low-grade steel became incredibly brittle. When a welded ship was hit by a massive wave or ran aground, a small crack could start and just keep going, unzippered across the entire hull. At least a dozen Liberty ships suffered catastrophic hull fractures, with 3 of them literally snapping in half without warning. The sailors who served on them gave them grim nicknames like serial sinkers and Kaiser's coffins. The SS Richard Montgomery was born in this crucible of urgent necessity. It was laid down in Jacksonville, Florida in 1943 by the St. Johns River Shipbuilding Company. It was a standard-issue Liberty ship, 441 feet long, capable of carrying over 10,000 tons of cargo, and powered by a simple steam engine that gave it a top speed of about 11 knots. It was named after an Irish-born general who fought and perished for the American Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. For over a year, the Montgomery served its purpose, crisscrossing the Atlantic and delivering vital supplies for the war effort. But in the summer of 1944, it received orders for its final, fateful voyage. The mission was to transport a massive cargo of aerial bombs and munitions from Philadelphia to the front lines in Europe. By August 1944, the D-Day landings had been successful, and Allied forces were pushing their way across France. These bombs were desperately needed to support the advance and strike targets deep within enemy territory. The Montgomery's holds were packed to the brim with over 6,000 tons of explosives. It was a floating powder keg, just one of thousands sailing the dangerous seas. The crew knew the risks, but it was their job. They joined a large convoy designated HX-301 for the perilous journey across the ocean, unaware that the greatest danger wasn't an enemy submarine, but a perfect storm of bad luck and human error. The ship's design flaws were a hidden danger, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. A sinking ship and a lost cause. In mid-August of 1944, the SS Richard Montgomery, heavy with its explosive cargo, safely crossed the Atlantic. Its destination was Cherbourg, France, but first it had to anchor in the Thames estuary to await the formation of a final convoy that would cross the English Channel. The Port of London Authority directed the ship to a designated anchorage spot in the Great Nore, a sandbank-ridden area near the town of Sheerness, and this is where the chain of events leading to the disaster began. You see, the ship's captain, an experienced mariner, was immediately concerned. The Montgomery was sitting low in the water due to its immense 7,000-ton cargo. He knew that the assigned berth was dangerously shallow. At low tide, he feared his ship could bottom out, scraping its hull on the sandbank below. His concerns were echoed and amplified by a man named Lieutenant Roger Foley, the assistant harbor master. Foley was adamant that the anchorage was a terrible idea. He argued forcefully with his superiors, insisting that the Montgomery should be moved to a deeper channel. His pleas were ignored. The official line was that all deepwater berths were occupied. In an act of incredible foresight and courage, Lieutenant Foley refused to verbally issue the order, demanding it be given to him in writing so he would not be held responsible for the inevitable. For his insubordination, he was promptly demoted and transferred. As it turns out, Foley was absolutely right. On August 20th, 1944, the weather turned. A fierce gale swept through the estuary. The Montgomery, swinging wildly on its anchor chain in the shallow water, finally did what its captain had feared. The ship dragged its anchor and ran aground on the sandbank. The turning tide began to do its work. As the water level dropped, the middle section of the ship was left supported by the sandbank, while the bow and stern, weighed down by thousands of tons of bombs, were pulled down by gravity. The immense stress was too much for the brittle, welded steel of the Liberty ship's hull. Those on board described hearing a series of sickening, gunshot-like cracks as the hull plates began to buckle and split. Knowing they were sitting on a mountain of high explosives that could go up at any moment, the captain made the only logical decision. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. A desperate salvage operation began the next day. Stevedores worked around the clock using the ship's own cranes to carefully lift the deadly cargo out of the forward holds and onto smaller vessels. For a few days, it seemed like they might avert disaster. They successfully removed about half of the munitions. But the ship was dying beneath them. The cracks grew longer and wider with each tide, and the flooding in the holds became impossible to control. Within days, the SS Richard Montgomery buckled, broke its back, and sank beneath the waves, taking its remaining 1.4 thousand tons of TNT with it. The salvage was called off, partly because it was now too dangerous, and partly, believe it or not, due to a pay dispute, and there it has remained ever since. For 80 years, the wreck has been a silent monument to a single, preventable error. A temporary fix for a permanent problem. For the past 8 decades, the SS Richard Montgomery has been the subject of a tense and uneasy standoff. On one side is the wreck, a slowly decaying chemical and explosive hazard. On the other are generations of scientists, engineers, and government officials who have been unable to agree on a safe way to neutralize the threat. What many don't realize is that the ship is under constant surveillance. The UK's Maritime and Coast Guard Agency conducts regular high-resolution sonar scans to monitor the wreck's condition, watching for any sign of further collapse. An exclusion zone, marked by large red buoys, is meant to keep all shipping and private boats at a safe distance of at least 1,600 feet. The core of the problem is a terrible paradox. The options for dealing with the bombs are limited, and all of them are incredibly dangerous. The first option is to attempt to remove the munitions. The thing is, this would require divers or, more likely, remotely operated vehicles to enter the crumbling, silt-filled holds. They would need to carefully lift each bomb one by one, but as we've discussed, the explosives are thought to be in a hypersensitive state. The friction from lifting a corroded bomb or bumping it against the wreckage could be enough to trigger the catastrophe everyone fears. It's a game of explosive Jenga where the slightest mistake means game over for everyone. The second option is a controlled detonation. In theory, this sounds straightforward, just blow it up and get it over with. However, the sheer scale of the explosion would be devastating. As a case study, in 1967, authorities performed a controlled detonation on another sunken munitions ship, the Keels, off the coast of Folkestone. The keels contained less than a tenth of the explosives on the Montgomery. The resulting blast left a 20-foot deep crater in the seabed, caused a tidal wave, damaged buildings 4 miles away, and registered a 4.5 on the Richter scale. Multiplying that destruction by 10 makes a controlled detonation of the Montgomery unthinkable. So the British government has long pursued a third option: do nothing. The official policy has been to let the wreck lie, monitor it, and hope for the best. But time is running out. The most immediate threat now comes from the ship's own masts. These heavy steel structures are degrading, and surveys have shown that they are at risk of collapsing. If a multi-ton mast were to fall and punch through the deck into the hold below, it could provide the exact shock needed to initiate an explosion. Recognizing this clear and present danger, authorities finally took action. A complex operation to carefully cut the mast down to size was undertaken to reduce the stress on the wreck's structure. But even this is just a temporary fix, like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem of the 1,400 tons of decaying explosives still sitting in the hold. The wreck remains a permanent, terrifying fixture in the estuary. The SS Richard Montgomery is a ticking time bomb left over from a global conflict. Should a government risk a disaster to remove it, or is it better to just leave it alone? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories.